Today, we're going to talk about one single number that pretty much rules the world: gross domestic product, or GDP. We're digging into a March 2026 report to figure out what this metric really tells us, and more importantly, what it's hiding. So, right off the bat, here's the big question. Can you really boil down the success of an entire nation, all its people, its progress, its well-being, into just one number? I think by the end of this, you might have a very different answer. All right, first things first. Before we can tear GDP apart, we've got to understand what it actually is. So let's pop the hood and see what's going on inside. Okay, so here's the official definition. GDP is the total value of all final goods and services a country produces. And that word final is super important. It means we only count the finished car that rolls off the lot, not the steel, the rubber, and the glass that went into making it. It's a clever way to avoid counting the same thing over and over. So how do they actually get to that number? Well, it usually comes down to this pretty simple formula. You've got C for consumption, that's all of us buying stuff. I is for investment, which is businesses spending on new equipment or buildings. G is government spending. And net exports is just what we sell to other countries minus what we buy from them. You add it all up, and boom, you've got GDP. And to see this in the real world, just look at a country like Brazil. A whopping 65% of their entire GDP comes from C, regular people buying things. It just goes to show you how much economies like this depend on consumer spending. When people get nervous and stop buying, the whole system feels it, and fast. Okay, so now we know what GDP is, but the more important question is, what is it not? This is where the story gets really interesting, because it turns out the number's biggest strengths are also its biggest weaknesses. So, blind spot number one, GDP tells you how big the economic pie is, but it says absolutely nothing about how the slices are cut. A country's GDP can be skyrocketing, but if all that new wealth is just going to the top 1%, life doesn't get any better for the average person. You see this all the time in places like the US and Brazil. Huge GDP, but also huge inequality. Now think about this for a second. What about all the work that keeps our society running but doesn't come with a paycheck? You know, childcare, cooking, cleaning, volunteering, taking care of an elderly relative. All of that is fundamentally important, but because no money changes hands, GDP counts it as a big fat zero. It's crazy, right? If you hire a cleaner, GDP goes up. If you clean your own house, it's invisible. And this might be the most backward part of it all. Imagine there's a massive oil spill. The money spent on the cleanup, that actually adds to GDP. A company clear cuts a forest to sell the timber, GDP goes up. The number gets bigger while our planet gets smaller. GDP doesn't just ignore the loss of our natural resources, it often counts their destruction as a win. And you know, this isn't some new radical critique. The guy who basically invented the modern idea of GDP, Simon Kuznets, he warned us about this himself, way back in 1934. He literally said you can't figure out how well a nation is doing just by looking at its income. The creator himself told us not to misuse it, and we've basically spent the last 90 years ignoring him. Which brings us to the real heart of the issue, right? We're measuring all this wealth, but what about well-being? Does a bigger GDP automatically mean a better, healthier, happier life for everyone? This comparison says it all. You take a country like Qatar, which has a gigantic GDP per person because of oil and gas. And then you have Costa Rica with a much smaller GDP, but guess what? Costa Rica often scores way higher on things like life expectancy, education, and happiness. The strategic insight here is pretty clear. It's not just about how much money you have, it's about how effectively you turn that money into a better life for your people. But hey, let's be clear, this doesn't mean GDP is useless. It has a very real impact on our lives. During the 2014 to 2016 recession in Brazil, the GDP fell by 7%. That wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It led to the worst cycle of unemployment in the country's recent history. So when GDP falls, it means real pain for real people. So, if GDP is this flawed but still important number, what do? Well, the future isn't about just throwing it away. It's about looking beyond it to get a much fuller picture of what's going on. The big idea now is to move towards something called a dashboard. Think about it like driving a car. You wouldn't just stare at the speedometer, right? You need other gauges. So we keep GDP, but we add things like the Human Development Index for health and education, or an ecological footprint to see if we're living sustainably. And the report this whole analysis is based on gives us the perfect way to think about it. It says that relying only on GDP is like trying to fly a plane while looking only at the altimeter. Sure, it tells you how high you are, but it doesn't tell you if you're about to fly straight into a mountain. You need the whole dashboard to fly safely. So the takeaway is this. GDP is a useful tool. It's great for measuring the size of an economy, but it is not the final word on a country's success. The goal is to use it wisely, understand its blind spots, and put it next to other numbers that tell the rest of the story.
Hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the numbers that secretly run our world, and you want more of these kinds of strategic insights, there's a lot more where this came from.
For more breakdowns on macroeconomics, AI, and technology, make sure you follow our channel, Macro and IA. We're always digging into complex topics like this one, so stay tuned for our next publication. And just a quick heads up, all this content is for educational purposes only. It is definitely not investment advice. Thanks for watching.